Hi, Steve Riley. Welcome to this incredible episode of Great Practice, Great Life. Today, I am here with the brilliant, talented Max Lugavere. Max, welcome to the show.
Steve, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
Oh, it's an honor for us. We gave you a couple of tryouts. First we saw you on the Joe Rogan show, and you did good there. It's a small podcast audience there. And then I saw you on Jordan Peterson, and now you finally made the big time here. We practice great life. So welcome to our little episode.
Oh, it's
So
so cool. I'm just happy that my work isn't falling on deaf ears.
it's
So,
not,
yeah.
it's not, it's not, and it's one of the reasons that we're asking you to speak at our conference. One of the reasons I'm grateful for you taking the time to talk to me today. You and I have some interesting common paths. So I'm going to lay down the common paths and then talk to you about how you chose a particular direction and um, see how this unfolds for both of us. So I had lunch with you for the only time in 2019, and you were at the time working on your documentary, which has just come out this year. Well done. I saw it this morning. Obviously, I cannot say enough about how great it is and what a great job you did. But what I was so impressed with you in 2019 was your determination. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because at the time you had just really started getting traction for the documentary. You just had a passion for it. Your working title, I think, was Breadhead. You had just gotten, I think, some attention from Dr. Perlmutter, and I think one or two other, Dr. Gundry, two or three other really great thinkers, which you've integrated into that. So I just want to say congratulations, well done, and great amount of courage, great amount of determination. But what was the center of this? What was the why? What was the reason that inspired you to do what you've done for, I think it's taken you 10 years to get this documentary over the finish line?
Yeah. Well, Steve, as you well know, my why is my mom. So I didn't take the conventional path to arrive at where I am today. Although my career began as a generalist journalist. I used to work for a TV network in the United States called Current, which allowed me a platform to speak to a huge audience about issues that I thought were being under discussed in the cultural zeitgeist. But it wasn't until my mom got sick that everything really came into focus for me, and it helped me understand I think my purpose on this earth, and that is to help people live a healthier lifestyle and avert the kinds of age-related chronic diseases, um, particularly of the sort that has afflicted my family. So my mom, at a young age, developed a rare form of dementia called Lewy body dementia. And I had no prior family history of any form of neurodegenerative disease. In fact, when my mom was first diagnosed, my maternal grandmother, so my mom's mom, was 30 years her senior and cognitively totally healthy. And so this was a really odd, traumatic turn of events that occurred in my own family life to the person that was the most important person to me on earth.
And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about type 3 diabetes and some of your insights and some of the research that you learned from Dr. Brown, if you don't mind. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're referencing Suzanne de la Monte, who is a researcher at Brown
Yeah,
University.
Brown University. Thank you.
Yeah,
Very
who
good.
who coined the term type 3 diabetes as a way of
Thank you.
conceptualizing Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia. And for decades, it was thought that Alzheimer's disease is essentially caused by an aggregation of plaque in the brain, plaque, and then coinciding with that, the appearance of misfolded proteins, a protein known as tau, and neurofibrillatory tangles, and other pathologies that are clearly observable in cadavers who have passed due to Alzheimer's disease. But we have had success pharmacologically with regards to reducing the plaque burden in the brain. And in fact, many cognitively healthy people do have an accumulation to some degree of these plaques in their brains without any impingement on cognitive function. So the field has, over the past, I would say, 10 or so years really been slowly but surely pivoting towards prevention in with the acknowledgement that these features, these plaques are essentially late stage features of the disease and not necessarily causal at that. And so what type 3 diabetes implies is that there's something else, some degree of metabolic dysfunction that's occurring in the body and the brain that is predisposing us to the cognitive dysfunction that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And I think what the data is starting to show is that it's more likely correlation in the sense that it's not necessarily causal. It's there at the scene of the crime. But, um, if you were to uh, look at house fires, you might see the correlation between the appearance of firefighters and fire trucks, and their strong correlation with the presence of a fire. And if you weren't scientifically literate, you might come to the erroneous conclusion that the fireman caused the fire, right? But so similar with regards to these plaques that we see in the brains of cadavers with Alzheimer's disease, and the fact that drugs have actually been greenlit that have succeeded at reducing the plaque in the brains of patients, but have not been successful in terms of improving the clinically meaningful symptoms that we aspire to improve in a patient suffering from Alzheimer's disease. The question now is, well, what is that first inciting incident or the risk factors or insults that is actually driving this accumulation of plaque in the brain and ultimately the cognitive dysfunction that we see? And a lot of people today are suffering, as I alluded to earlier, from metabolic dysfunction. And we're starting to see now that metabolic dysfunction is inflammatory and that the brain sits directly downwind of that inflammatory process. And conditions like type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, which are now seemingly rampant in modern society, that essentially the degree of insulin resistance that a person is experiencing in their periphery in their bodies is actually a pretty strong indicator of a brain in despair.
This is one of the big issues I've seen with a lot of my colleagues is that they're not getting. And one of my dearest friends is a vegan, and I worry about him greatly because I think his protein intake is sparse at best, right? So, um, talk to me about red meat. Red meat bad, red meat good.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken a lot of flack for this because the nutritional orthodoxy still likes to die on the hill of incredibly weak epidemiologic data, which fairly consistently links red meat consumption to negative health outcomes. Although, when you actually know how to interpret data, you see that the increase in relative risk is actually incredibly small. Um, that we see from these epidemiologic studies. And epidemiology is the study of populations, right? And we try to isolate individual variables and tie that to health outcomes, positive or negative. But nutrition is incredibly complicated. I mean, we don't just eat nutrients in isolation. We eat foods, and the kinds of foods that we choose with every meal tends to correlate to other dietary and lifestyle habits. And lo and behold, because red meat has been demonized for the past 50 or so years, people that tend to eat more meat tend to be more sedentary. They tend to smoke. They tend to drink more alcohol. They tend to exercise less. They seem to be less likely to take, for example, a multivitamin. And so this is referred to as healthy user bias. And epidemiologists do try to control for a lot of these variables. They try to adjust for a lot of these variables, like is a person a smoker or not a smoker when they arrive at these relative risk ratios. But there's always confounding variables at play. There's always what's called residual confounding. And to hang your hat on such a small increase in relative risk, I think is really nonsensical from the standpoint of nutrition. Um, for example, an increase in relative risk of about 25%, we'll just say, that takes your absolute risk from 4% to 5%, right? So that's an incredibly small increase in absolute risk. The 25% number, I mean, that's a lot more startling if you were to see that, because eating red meat increases your risk of developing X by 25%. I mean, I don't want to increase my risk of developing heart disease by 25%. But the distinction is seldom made in these headlines that there's a difference, and a really important difference between relative risk and absolute risk. And these associations are also mired, as I mentioned, by residual confounding. I mean, what population is being studied? If you're looking at the, at the population level, I mean, it's certainly true that people who eat more red meat are more prone to unhealthy lifestyle choices.